On June 12, 2025, the dust settled quietly across the Sahel. There were no headlines, no international press conference, and yet history had been rewritten. In the heart of West Africa, one of the world's poorest countries did something that few dared to imagine. Burkina Faso took back its gold. Not metaphorically, literally. 5 of the country's largest gold mines, some of them operated by Canadian companies for over a decade, were nationalized overnight. No compensation, no negotiation. Just a quiet transfer of power from Toronto boardrooms to offices in Ouagadougou. And the world said, nothing. No lawsuits, no outcry, not even a warning shot. Because by the time anyone realized what had happened, it was already done. A country long dismissed as too poor, too unstable, too small, had just pulled off one of the most strategic economic revolutions in modern African history. And here's the most astonishing part: it's working. Gold is flowing. Local engineers are in charge. And instead of profits vanishing overseas, they're now funding schools, clinics, and infrastructure for the people who actually live above the mines. So here's the question. No one's asking out loud. Can a state-owned African company really outperform billion-dollar multinationals? And should more countries follow Burkina Faso's path before it's too late? If you've ever wondered why nations rich in resources remain poor in dignity, this is the story you've been waiting for. You're watching a channel that doesn't speak for Africa, we listen to it. Please like this video if you believe gold should serve the people, not just shareholders. Subscribe if you want more stories that rewrite the headlines. And comment below, should Canada have fought back, or did they know the age of control was over? The story doesn't begin with a dramatic speech or a late-night raid. It begins, as so many revolutions do, with quiet resolve. In August 2024, Burkina Faso passed a revised mining code. At first glance, it looked like a typical legislative update, just another bureaucratic reform. But buried in the fine print was a clause that would soon shake the entire foundation of foreign mining in West Africa: a mandatory 10% state ownership in all new operations, with the right to increase that stake to 70% in strategic cases. It wasn't just a change in numbers, it was a change in posture. For decades, foreign firms, especially Canadian, had dominated Burkina Faso's gold sector. Companies like Endeavour Mining Simofo and Fortuna Silver Mines ran high-yield mines that exported tens of tons of gold each year. The offices may have been in Toronto or Vancouver, but the profits came straight from African soil. And the people living above that soil, most of them never saw a dollar of it. That's the question Interim President Ibrahim Traoré asked when he took power in 2022. How does a nation sitting on billions in gold struggle to build schools and hospitals? It wasn't a rhetorical question, it was a provocation. In early 2024, signs began to surface. Foreign mining licenses were delayed, reevaluated, and subjected to new environmental audits. New taxes were drafted. Decisions that used to take weeks now took months, or simply vanished in silence. By mid-2024, it became clear that the ground beneath Canada's mining giants was shifting. The message wasn't screamed, it was whispered: we're not waiting anymore. And then came June 12, 2025. Without warning, Burkina Faso announced that 5 of the largest active gold mining operations, some in full production, others under Canadian control for years, would now be operated by a newly established state company, SOAPAIB, Société du Patrimoine Minier du Burkina. This wasn't a negotiation. There were no buyouts, no compensation packages, no legal battles. It was a clean and complete handover. And most remarkably, Canada did not fight back. Why? Several reasons. First, challenging the takeover in international courts would be expensive, lengthy, and politically volatile, especially given Canada's own controversies around its mining practices in Africa. Allegations of labor abuse, environmental degradation, and unfair profit sharing had followed Canadian firms for years. Pushing too hard now would only reignite those headlines. Second, many of these firms were still operating in other African countries. If they retaliated too harshly, they risked losing even more licenses across the continent. But the deeper truth was simpler and more devastating. Burkina Faso didn't blink. The government offered no middle ground, no compromise. They made it clear, this gold belongs to the people, and it's staying here. What made the decision even more stunning was that these weren't failing or depleted sites. These were high-yield, well-run mines producing hundreds of thousands of ounces of gold per year. There were no rusty machines or abandoned pits. These were the crown jewels of Canadian extraction in West Africa. And now they were gone. The immediate impact was profound. Foreign firms began issuing vague press releases citing regulatory uncertainty or regional risk. One major player, Fortuna Silver Mines, announced it was shifting its focus to Guinea. It never mentioned Burkina Faso by name. It didn't need to. Everyone in the industry knew what it meant. Meanwhile, the stock prices of several mining firms dropped. Billions in market capitalization vanished in days. Investors realized that the age of guaranteed access to African resources was ending, not with a bang, but with a signature. And all the while, SOAPAIB got to work. In just weeks, local engineers, geologists, finance teams, many of whom had previously worked under foreign contracts, began running the very mines they had once operated from the sidelines. But now they answered not to Toronto, but to Ouagadougou. For the first time in living memory, Burkina Faso's gold was being managed by Burkina Faso itself. It was not just a change in management, it was a change in narrative. This was no longer about foreign aid or extractive contracts. This was about resource dignity, economic sovereignty, and the rebirth of national control. And it all began without a single gunshot court ruling or televised announcement. Just a line in the sand and the quiet sound of old contracts expiring. What happened next wasn't a riot. It wasn't a televised revolution. It was something more unsettling for the global elite. It was order, calm, coordination, and control. From the outside, there were no protests, no angry mobs outside embassies, no military standoffs at mine entrances. But inside the boardrooms of Toronto and Geneva, alarm bells were ringing. How did we lose everything without a single shot fired? The answer lay in what Burkina Faso had done differently. This wasn't a hasty nationalization born of desperation or ideology. It was a choreographed strategy, a war of attrition waged with contracts, not tanks. As early as Q1 2024, Site 24 foreign mining firms began noticing something strange. Site inspections were taking longer. Paperwork piled up. New environmental regulations suddenly applied retroactively. Permits were delayed. Small issues became costly obstacles. One Canadian executive reportedly told his board, "It feels like we're being squeezed out without being told to leave." They were right. The revised mining code passed in August 2024 wasn't just a legal framework, it was a lever. It gave the state power to demand up to 70% ownership in strategic operations, and gold was without question strategic. Firms that had operated with near total control for years were suddenly facing a future where they would be minority shareholders in their own mines. And many chose to cut their losses. One by one, the multinationals began pulling out. Not because they were forced, no security forces marched into their compounds, but because they understood the new rules were non-negotiable. There would be no secret deals, no stabilization clauses, no arbitration safety nets. This was not a revolution of rhetoric, it was a revolution of structure. What made the world take notice wasn't just the takeover itself, it was what came after. Gold production didn't stop. In fact, it surged. Government data showed that in Q1 2025 alone, Burkina Faso's state-controlled operations collected over 11 tons of gold, an estimated $780 million worth at current market prices. That was more gold in a single quarter than some multinational firms had declared in entire fiscal years. And it wasn't just being dug up, it was staying home. Instead of routing exports through refineries in Switzerland or Dubai, Burkina Faso began exploring regional partnerships with Mali and Niger to establish an African refining hub. This would allow the country to refine and sell high-purity gold, which commands significantly higher prices on the international market. International investors were stunned. They had been told by economists, consultants, even African ministers in earlier decades that African governments could never manage large-scale mining efficiently. That nationalization would always lead to mismanagement and collapse. But here was Burkina Faso not only maintaining operations but expanding them, and doing so with the very same engineers, technicians, and geologists who once worked under foreign banners. The lie was exposed. The problem was never capacity. It was control. And so while the global press looked elsewhere, while headlines were dominated by elections, conflict, and debt crises, a silent revolution was winning. In Toronto and Montreal, the Canadian government received calls, but no one rushed to file lawsuits or seek arbitration. The optics were too dangerous. The legacy of Canadian mining in Africa had already been tainted by years of accusations, polluted rivers, unsafe working conditions, land grabs, and profit repatriation. To fight back now would only rekindle those fires. Instead, Canadian firms released polite press statements about changing market conditions and refocusing investments. Behind the euphemisms was the truth: they had been evicted without a fight, and on the ground in Burkina Faso, there were no celebrations, no victory parades, only work. SOAPAIB began issuing contracts to local companies for transportation security equipment maintenance. It activated a domestic supply chain that had long been sidelined by foreign firms relying on imported logistics. And more importantly, it created a sense of ownership. For the first time, entire communities surrounding the mines didn't just see trucks carrying gold, they saw jobs, schools, roads, clinics, futures. And in a world where headlines still dismiss Africa as dependent, unstable, or corrupt, Burkina Faso quietly sent a message loud enough for anyone who was listening: we do not need permission to manage what is already ours. This was the real climax, not the moment the mines changed hands, but the moment a people realized they didn't need outside approval to build, manage, and benefit from their own wealth. The gold had always been there, so had the expertise. Now, finally, so was the will. For most of its post-colonial history, Burkina Faso had all the symptoms of a resource-cursed state: abundant gold, extreme poverty, crumbling infrastructure, and governments trapped in debt cycles. But in just 1 year, the country began turning that curse into capital. The first impact was visible in rural communities. Where once mining trucks rumbled past villages without stopping, now government vehicles arrive with building supplies. In Q1 2025 alone, state-run operations generated enough revenue to fund new schools in Gawa, health clinics in Kaya, and water projects in Dori. These were not promises on political posters. These were structures built with gold mined 50 kilometers away and refined under state control. Residents began seeing the literal transformation of dust into dignity. Parents in mining towns who once feared toxic runoff and unexplained illnesses are now receiving medical outreach from government-funded health teams. Children who watched trucks leave every morning now step into classrooms constructed with revenue from those very same mines. Gold that once bled out of the country now circulates within it, creating jobs, stabilizing families, and restoring public trust. Politically, the shift was even more dramatic. Burkina Faso's mining revolution didn't just redistribute wealth, it reshaped power. For decades, political leadership in Burkina Faso, like in many African countries, was stuck in a cycle of managing foreign contracts rather than designing national policy. Presidents and ministers were often forced to accommodate multinational interests, to secure loans, attract investment, or avoid diplomatic fallout. But under President Ibrahim Traoré, the paradigm flipped. Instead of negotiating from weakness, the Burkinabe state began setting the terms. By nationalizing mining operations and creating SOAPAIB, the government no longer needed to beg for infrastructure loans from abroad. It now had a domestic source of revenue, unattached to IMF conditions or Western assistance. This newly found fiscal independence began shaping broader reforms. In early 2025, the government announced a nationwide push to audit and reclaim dormant foreign-owned assets across other sectors: telecommunications, energy, and agriculture. The message was clear: sovereignty is no longer symbolic, it's operational. And the effect on public morale was palpable. Where once cynicism ruled, now a cautious sense of hope began to emerge. People didn't just cheer speeches, they watched bulldozers building. They didn't just hear slogans, they received receipts from government-run programs funded directly by mining revenue. But the ripple effects extended beyond national borders. Other African nations took note. In Bamako, Mali's government initiated a review of gold export contracts. In Niamey, Niger opened consultations on uranium royalties. Across the Sahel, civil society groups began demanding similar state-led reforms, citing Burkina Faso as proof that it was not only possible but profitable to take back control. Traoré's model didn't just inspire governments, it emboldened the people. In university halls and rural cooperatives, the conversation shifted. No longer was the question, how do we attract more foreign investors? It became, why should we keep giving away what we already own? For years, Western development experts claimed that African countries couldn't manage large-scale operations. They warned that nationalization would lead to inefficiency, corruption, or collapse. But Burkina Faso's steady gold output and expanding infrastructure told a different story. Not only could the state manage, it could outperform. Still, the risks remain. Running a national mining enterprise is no small task. Equipment must be maintained. Export markets must be secured. Skilled labor must be retained. And political stability must be protected against external pressures and internal sabotage. But perhaps the greatest risk is also its greatest achievement expectation. Now that citizens have seen what national control can deliver, they will no longer tolerate excuses. Traore's government has raised the bar, and history shows that unmet expectations can be more dangerous than poverty itself. And yet for now, there is movement, there is progress, there is pride. In a region long defined by dependency and crisis, Burkina Faso has carved a new path, one where a nation's gold no longer gilds the halls of European banks, but lays the foundation for schools, clinics, and sovereignty. And it all started with a single decision: let the gold stay. While Canadian firms were the first to feel the impact of Burkina Faso's mining revolution, the tremor didn't stop at Toronto. It reached Washington, it reached Brussels, and it reached Beijing. For decades, Western powers, particularly the United States, have viewed Africa through a familiar lens, a continent of strategic resources, humanitarian need, and geopolitical leverage, a place to invest influence and, when convenient, exploit. But something shifted in 2025 as the U.S. State Department watched 5 fully operational gold mines transition into state hands without chaos, corruption, or collapse. A quiet discomfort began to take hold. The model that had justified over a century of foreign control, that Africa needed external expertise and capital, was losing credibility. Burkina Faso hadn't just taken back its gold, it had taken back the narrative. Suddenly, policymakers and analysts in Washington were asking new questions. What happens if other African countries follow suit? What if gold, uranium, cobalt, and rare earths are no longer negotiated through corporate boardrooms, but through sovereign ministries? What does that mean for supply chains, defense procurement, and industrial inputs? In think tanks and Capitol Hill briefings, Burkina Faso's move was no longer seen as a fringe experiment. It was a potential blueprint. And for U.S. corporations with stakes in African energy, telecom, and mining sectors, the implications were clear. The age of automatic access might be over. The broader Western press remained largely silent. Few major headlines, no editorial outrage. But beneath the surface, multinational lobbies began pressing quietly for engagement strategies and regional stabilization efforts, code words for preserving influence in a region beginning to act on its own terms. Meanwhile, China and Russia watched with interest, albeit for different reasons. China, already deep into infrastructure and mining partnerships across Africa, saw in SOAPAIB a sign that African states could be ready for more equitable state-to-state arrangements rather than subcontracted ventures with Western oversight. Russia, positioning itself as an anti-Western ally for resource-rich states, praised the move publicly as a blow to neo-colonial interference. But the real story wasn't about geopolitics, it was about precedent. Burkina Faso had set a powerful example not through speeches, but through results. And now the world was watching, not because the gold changed hands, but because for the first time in a generation, the hands that held the gold were African. And they weren't letting go. Burkina Faso didn't ask for permission. It didn't threaten, plead, or protest. It simply acted. And in doing so, it triggered a quiet shift that could reshape the next century of African development. What happened in those gold mines is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about whether nations still have the right to define their own futures without interference. It's about what real sovereignty looks like in a world that often confuses capitalism with freedom. But there is a caution here too. Success brings attention, and attention brings pressure. What happens when Burkina Faso's rise begins to threaten corporate profits and international supply chains? What happens when its success becomes too loud to ignore? Will it face isolation, sanctions, or will it inspire others to stand taller? This is no longer just a mining story. It is a story of identity, resilience, and resistance. A country that was once written off as a casualty of poverty and insurgency has redefined itself, not as a victim of global economics, but as an author of its own chapter in world history. Now the question turns to us. Do we believe in a world where African nations can lead their own industries? Can public ownership and local expertise truly outperform multinational giants? Should more nations follow Burkina Faso's path, or is this model too risky to replicate? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, especially if you've lived long enough to see similar fights for sovereignty elsewhere in the world. Share this video with someone who still thinks Africa must ask permission to rise. And if you believe the truth should be louder than the headlines, hit that subscribe button, because the gold is staying, and so is the will to decide what happens to it.